Welcome to this online workshop for producing financially quantified value propositions. I'm an emeritus professor at Cranfield University School of Management, and I'm also chairman of 6 companies. Grant has over 25 years experience in selling B2B in many different sectors and countries. He has spent the last 2 years purchasing technology for the National Health Service, and it has been a rather sobering experience for him because of the supplier's lack of understanding of the customer requirements. Just over 2 years ago, we began to explore whether the statement by McKinsey that only 5% of companies have value propositions was true, and if so, what we should do about it. So we did our own research, and we estimate that it is less than 5%, and Grant has been appalled at the low quality of sales presentations by suppliers for what are frequently substantial investments by the National Health Service in technology. Accordingly, as I said, we researched the topic and found very little by way of actionable propositions. So we developed a rigorous process for developing financially quantified value propositions and tested it on a number of multinational companies and small-medium enterprises. We're delighted to report that our process works and has been successfully adopted by our clients. We've recorded the process in our Kogan Page book on the topic, which will be published in early 2018, and we're pleased to be able to spell out the process in this online workshop. This online workshop is for anyone who has to deal with customers in the B2B sector. It's in 8 modules, each one of which is about half an hour. It consists of a number of PowerPoint slides which will be explained in detail by either Grant or me. Each one is followed by a number of exercises into which you input your own data. We do, however, promise you that you will end up with financially quantified value propositions. The modules are this first one, what problems are we solving for you in this workshop and why should you change? Then we have 6 modules in which we spell out the process steps, and there is a final one, conclusions and further actions. So let us start with the problems that we're going to solve for you and why we think you should change. We're going to begin with the need, the justification for financially quantified value propositions, which seems like a good place to start. We want to start by showing you a particular slide which is in common use by buying managers and buying directors. We know this because we started a research club at Cranfield University School of Management 21 years ago, and the purpose of this was to explore this new domain of key account management. And we've got sponsors like Siemens, 3M, Rolls-Royce, and lots of companies like that. They set the agenda and we carry out the research, and it's in its 21st year. Now, I should explain that about 50% of the people who come along to present to our Key Account Management Research Club are on the buying side, for obvious reasons, because we think it's equally important that we should represent the buying point of view as well as the supplier's point of view. One of the interesting things, however, is that virtually every buying director or buying manager who comes along uses a version of the slide that you can see here. If you look at the horizontal axis, the bottom left says the company doesn't buy a lot, and as you move along to the right, the company buys a lot. If you look at the vertical axis, it has different labels. This particular one is called low attractiveness up to high attractiveness at the very top of it, but what it really means is differentiation. So for the purpose of this explanation, we'll talk about low differentiation at the bottom, moving up the top towards high differentiation. Now, an interesting box is the top left-hand box. This might be even a small supplier, for example, who supplies an ingredient for a company that gives its product a special taste. And they do look after suppliers like that very well, and price is not, very rarely price is an issue. The top right hand box is the one we really want to draw your attention to, because we've discovered over our 21 years of research that very little more than 1% of suppliers are actually in this box. And I mean, that's a terrifyingly low number, which means 99% are not in the box. But the interesting thing is that we know from listening to hundreds of buying directors that suppliers who are in that top right hand box, they are prepared to pay between 15 and 25% premium to deal with you. And again, price very, very rarely ever gets mentioned if you happen to be fortunate enough to be in that top right hand box. Now let's move to the sad part of the matrix below the line. In particular, if you look at the bottom right hand box, that's where many suppliers find themselves, because what they're doing is pretty well the same, what they're offering is pretty well the same as any other supplier, and the buyers do what any sensible buyer would do. If you can buy something from anywhere and it works, you will buy on price. And that also applies to the bottom left hand box. Now, I wanted to say, we both want to say a few things about price, and we'll talk about price on the next slide. This is another slide that we have borrowed from our purchasing friends from the Key Account Management Research Club. You will see two circles, the top one and the bottom one, both which spell out the amount of money that this particular buyer spends on outside purchases. And you'll see that if it is 50% and the buyer can get that down in the bottom circle by 5%, you'll observe that that goes straight into the bottom line of the organization. And any sensible buyer, if they can buy materials, for example, from anywhere and they're all equally good, they all work, it's a sensible thing to do to run the buying department on price. Grant and I also use this slide a lot because it brings into stark relief, for suppliers in particular, the disastrous effects of discounting. For example, if you've got a product where the price is £10, the profit is £2 and you sell 100, and one of your salespeople comes to you and says, look boss, for a 5% discount we can keep the business. Note, not we can get the business, but we can keep the business. If you look down that particular column, you'll see that the price then comes down to £9.50, the profit comes down to £1.50, and you have to sell 33 1/3% more just to make the same amount of profit. A 10% discount on the right is even worse, because the price comes down to £9, the profit comes down to £1, and you have to sell twice as many to make the same amount of profit as you were making before. To help you with this awful conundrum, Grant and I frequently produce this particular slide, which we hope you will find helpful. The way it works is as follows. If you look along the top, you will see the margin, 20%, the example we gave you, and if you look down the left hand side, you'll see one of the examples was a 5% discount, and if you go along there and find the point of intersection, you'll find that you have to sell 33.3% more to make the same amount of profit, and so on and so forth. So we hope you find this useful, particularly when considering requests from your sales force for discounts. The point we really want to make is that price is only ever an issue in the absence of quantified value. That is our experience, particularly since we started our research into financially quantified value propositions. And of course it's the supplier's job to quantify the value, not that of the buying organization. So, what this slide says is that customers expect their businesses to be better off as a result of dealing with you. So, the questions you've got to be able to answer, there are many more than this, but here are three of them. How will your offer enable your customer to serve their customers better? How will your offer enable your customers to be more competitive? And this one's particularly important. How will dealing with you make your customers more profitable? We'll answer these questions and more in later modules of this workshop. We do, however, want to spell out something, and we want to emphasize this. The slide, as you can see, says that you must be able to prove that dealing with you will create advantage for your customer, not merely help them avoid disadvantage. These aren't academic words that don't mean anything. If you think about it, most organizations, they need laptops, they need furniture, they need raw materials, etc., etc. Now, most of the things like this that they purchase, what they really do at the best is to help them to avoid disadvantage, because they would be disadvantaged if they didn't have them. So the $64,000 question, which we want to answer during this online workshop, is how, instead of just avoiding disadvantage for your customer, how can you help them create advantage? And if you can do that, we promise you that price will totally disappear from the equation. The case for financially quantified value propositions is really powerful. And although we haven't put all of the points down here, we have put a few down which we'd like just to point up. Firstly, only 5% of companies have financially quantified value propositions, and developing them will definitely differentiate your company. And I think most of us appreciate today that 90% of the buying cycle is done before speaking to suppliers. But even if you don't have any differentiation, the very act of financially quantifying the benefits, even if they're standard benefits, will give you an advantage over a competitor who doesn't do this. You'll close more deals, typically an additional 2 to 5 to 10%. The sales cycle will be reduced by between 10 and 25%, and it will help to reduce discounting by 20 to 30%. And Grant will explain this in more detail in the slides that follow. There are other benefits, of course. They're slightly harder to quantify financially, but they exist nonetheless. And we've just put 4 of them down here. Avoidance of no or delayed decisions to buy, improved customer relationships, referrals from satisfied customer, and of course sustained relationships. Many of you will remember the Bain and Company research in the early 1990s, where they discovered that a 5% improvement in customer retention can lead to a 75% increase in your profits. Now, to be perfectly honest, we don't think that Bain and Company, Harvard Business Review, Forrester, and companies like this are telling lies when they come up with figures like this. And we find it quite remarkable that companies, mostly, they measure the customers they've acquired. What they don't measure and report are the number of customers they've lost. So just remember, a 5% improvement in customer retention can lead to a massive increase in profits. So this is a major decision why we should pay attention to this particular module.
Hi, I'm Grant Oliver, and Malcolm has asked me to discuss this sales velocity. I've used this on a number of occasions with business-to-business sales teams, and there's 4 factors. Number 1, the number of leads. This is really the area where marketing have the most influence. This is multiplied by the closure rate, then by the average deal size, and then finally divided by the sales cycle. And I'll explain each of these points on the next few slides. On this slide, I have put some real numbers in from companies that I've worked with. So the number of leads is 125, the closure rate is 20%, and the average deal size is £120,000, and the sales cycle is 3 months, giving £1 million per month. And as Malcolm mentioned earlier, typically, and these are typical numbers, but we're going to come back to that later on, you will close more deals by an additional 2 to 10%. It will help to reduce discounting by 20 to 30%, i.e. it's likely that the deal size is likely to go up by that amount. And finally, the sales cycle will be reduced by 10 to 25% through putting together quantified value propositions. I mentioned at the beginning that the first item, the number of leads, is where marketing will have most impact. And for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to assume that the number of leads have not increased. Let's have a look at closure rate, item number 2 in the equation in the centre. Lots of research has been done on this, and yes, it does vary between existing business and new business. And I'm going to show some examples of that and across different types of industries. McKinsey's have done some research into this particular area, and they've even split it down between large customers, mid-sized customers and small customers. And you'll see that there is a variation between new and existing, and of course the size of the customer. But to give you some indications, down at the bottom, small customers, new business, the closure rate's probably about 20%. As we move up, similarly for mid-sized customers, for new customers, again it's probably only about 20%, and it does increase. And you can see it increasing as we move from new to existing. And it's very useful to get yourself to think about, well, what is the real closure rate that we're achieving, and how does it vary from account manager to account manager? This slide gives us an indication of the closure rate by industry. And yes, there are some variations, but what's interesting, if you just take the average and we look in the column right at the far right, for new business it's around 20%, and for existing business it's around 30%. And you can see the variations, and you can take whatever number you think is appropriate to you and plug it in to the equation. My experience in working in lots of industries is that people do overestimate what it is, so I think you need to be realistic about it. So let's look at the next item, average deal size, and what is it for your industry. Malcolm has already mentioned pricing in some detail, but as we know, there's often too much discounting going on because that's an easy thing to do, particularly at the quarter end and year end. And of course buyers are aware of this, so they're always looking for discounts because they know the sales team are trying to achieve their targets and commission payments. So everyone's wised up to this over the years. I think the other interesting thing is only 16% of your customers buy on price. And because of that, you really do have to know the value that you are delivering. And that really does give you the opportunity to move prices up. And finally, the sales cycle. Again, it's dangerous to use typical numbers, but certainly in a number of industries, typical sales cycle will be 3 months. Yes, it does extend much longer in some industries. In big capital goods, it can run out to 12 to 18 months. But what I see happen a lot is sales get stuck because it becomes very difficult for the buyer to make a decision. In fact, lots of deals are lost because no decision is made at all, because it's not obvious to them why they should buy and why they should change. The great thing about quantified value propositions is that you can demonstrate the benefits, the return on investment, the payback that they're likely to get. And the other thing that we like to build into the model is to show people the cost of delaying. So, if you're going to make X amount of benefits and savings in the year, show them how much per month the delay is going to take or cost them. That really does concentrate the board's minds into making a decision more rapidly. Here is an example of a sales cycle for the NHS, and this typically will run between 16 weeks and 26 weeks. That's 4 months running out to as much as 6 months. And as was said earlier, I've done a lot of work buying and selling into the NHS, and it is a long, slow process. But as I mentioned earlier, it does often get held up because the buyers find it very difficult to make the decision because it's not really clear what the benefits are. And it means that somebody is then pulling together internally a business case for this particular product when the supplier should be providing that and demonstrating all the returns. In this last slide on sales velocity, we're showing an example based on some of the points I've talked about earlier. What I've done is just to say, okay, the number of leads is 125, and from the top box to the bottom box, you can see that that hasn't changed because that's marketing's area of expertise. The closure rate I've shown at 20%, which is the typical number that we've seen, particularly for new business. And in the bottom box, that's increased by 10%. And again, I've shown the average deal size to be 120,000, and it's increased because we're not doing as much discounting overall by 10%. And then finally we've reduced the sales cycle from 3 months to 2.7 months, and that shows an overall increase of 34%. What I'd like you to do is to work out what that sales velocity looks like in your business. It may be overall, it may be account manager by account manager. It is a really useful exercise to do. And I think as you work through this program, you can then begin to see the benefits that you're going to get from quantified value propositions.
Okay, we've come to the point where we feel we really need to define what we mean by a financially quantified value proposition. We've uncovered many definitions of this, but we've summarized it as follows. The translation of your offer, the supplier's offers, into monetary terms and the demonstration of their contribution to the customer's profitability. Just want to add a few thoughts here. If you look at most websites, you'll find those websites witter on about the company, the supplier, me, I, and customers don't care about you. Customers only care about their own problems, and this is why this particular topic is so crucially important. We will spell out the components of a value proposition in a lot more detail in modules 2 to 7. This is just a summary. The first bullet point really means, if everything boils down to the essentials, it's about helping the company to make more money. Cost reduction is quite easily measured. Cost avoidance is easily measured, and we will show you how in later modules. The emotional contribution is much harder to measure, and yet it is crucially important. The point we would make and remind you about is that customers and consumers are not rational. We've never met a rational customer yet. Just because they work for an organization doesn't mean that they stop being people. And we remind you that you don't sell anything to an organization or a company, you sell it to people in organizations. And this is where confidence, self-esteem, the powerful brand name. Things like this come into play. It's all about trust, and it's all about people. And we will again expand on this in later modules. So we need to get started, and we have to start somewhere. So we need you to decide for which markets and customers you want to develop value propositions. The next slide, which we will come to in a moment, has an exercise which we would like you to complete. You already know that about 20% of your products and customers account for about 80% of your revenue. This, of course, is the well-known Pareto law, the Lorenz curve if you're more of an academic bent. But when you've done it, check carefully that this is the right 20%. And if it is, we'd like you to select one of the boxes to take forward in this workshop. So start by selecting a business unit or part of the business for which you wish to develop a value proposition. Along the top of the table, list the principal products that you are interested in, and down the left-hand side, put the principal markets or market segments you sell into, ignoring unimportant ones. Now, I'm Malcolm McDonald, I used to be Marketing and Sales Director of Canada Dry many years ago, but we had hundreds of products. But at the end of the day, it was only some of them that were really important to us. So we had, for example, things like mixers, things like fruit juices, things like lemonades, those kinds of things, product groups. And the markets into which we sold them were markets like the airline industry, the supermarket industry, the hotel industry, and so on and so forth. So that's how it works. And if you could put your sales in each of those boxes, and we do stress, please ignore unimportant products and unimportant markets, but if you could put your own sales in there, and preferably, although it's not essential, the market size as well, this is where you will discover the 80-20 rule, and we ask you to think carefully about this and to select one of them to take forward into subsequent modules. As a final exercise in this first module, we ask you to score your organization on a scale of 1 to 10 against the statement, our value propositions for relevant customers are financially quantified, justified, and proven. We've tried this out on a number of audiences, large and small, multinationals and small medium enterprises, and I'm afraid to tell you that the scores that we get are generally speaking on the very low side. So please be honest when you complete this exercise. And this marks the end of the first module, and in future modules we will start moving into actionable propositions.